You can convert kids surgically. So tell me how we can be having this conversation even. It's just beyond comprehension.
Yeah, it's. I think people have very differing views. A lot of people just want to tolerate it and say this is fine.
Tolerate what? Tolerate what? Castration and double mastectomies for 13-year-olds?
Can we get serious now?
Yeah,
No, seriously,
yeah,
man.
Yeah.
That's not tolerance. No, God! That's crossed the line. That is not tolerance. That is an inexcusable silence on the part of the majority, the vast majority, who knows this to be wrong in the deepest possible sense. Most of the bloody Nazi propaganda that led to the extermination policies at the beginning of World War II were predicated initially on compassion and tolerance. So this whole, we're being compassionate and tolerant, it's like, no, you're not.
I felt his frustration when he said, no, seriously, man. Tolerance is not always a good thing. 13-year-olds can't drink, smoke cigarettes, get married, have a job, have legal sex, vote, get a tattoo, yet they could make a life-altering decision to surgically change their sex. He silenced the man and showed him the truth.
Look, women have to express aggression somehow unless you're willing to say that they're not aggressive. They tend not to do it physically, not to the degree men do, so they use other channels. And what other channels are there other than physical aggression if you're going to be aggressive? Well, you go after people verbally. You go after them with innuendo and gossip and reputation destruction. And that's how it works.
And just to be clear, that you think that's predominantly a female modus operandi?
It isn't that I think that.
Well,
it's that the clinical literature indicates that. It isn't that I think it.
Well, I'm not interviewing the clinical literature. I'm interviewing you. What do you think?
Well, I'm a psychologist and a scientist, and I tend
to
to base my opinions on what I've read in the broad, relevant clinical literature. I'm not making this stuff up. I studied antisocial behavior for like 15 years. I'm actually quite an expert on it.
She literally just proved his point by attacking his reputation. She attempted to dismiss his response because it was based on scientific literature rather than his own feelings about the matter. Sometimes people can't handle the truth. It's up to them. As an individual, you tell the truth and leave the rest to them.
Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
So you haven't sat there and I'm just trying to work that out. I mean,
got him!
You have got me. I'm trying to work that through in my head. Yeah, it took a while.
It did, yeah.
It took a while.
Boom.
I feel he opened her eyes to something she didn't realize. This is how conversations should go in disagreements. The fact that he's responsible about shutting her down and not being rude in any way, and the fact that she actually accepted it as the perfect example of what we all need to act like. Respect to both of them.
What is the antidote towards toxic masculinity?
What precisely is toxic masculinity, as opposed to, say, toxic femininity?
The moment when you go over a boundary that kind of neglects the freedom of the opposite, well, gender or whatsoever. So
but that would also be toxic femininity. And so part of what's happened in our discourse is that we're required ethically to assume a priori, merely out of politeness, that the utterance toxic masculinity actually constitutes a meaningful phrase. And if you push it, you find very rapidly that it doesn't, because it's very, very, very difficult to define, and definitions actually matter. And so if it's a matter of transgressing against the boundaries of gender-appropriate behavior, it's just as likely to happen among women as among men, in which case it's not toxic masculinity.
This is the most polite way of telling someone you're not making sense out of what you're saying. When you find yourself parroting a certain phrase, you have successfully been conditioned. Definitions actually matter. Such a simple phrase, but so meaningful at the same time.
It's okay to hate trans people.
No, it's not okay, particularly to hate anyone, maybe even your enemies. And what I've talked about has virtually nothing to do in any real technical sense with trans people. The stance I took on Bill C-16 was an anti-compelled speech stance, and I stand by it.
Government.
Absolutely. There's never been a piece of legislation in the history of the English common law that compelled private speech. Not once. There has been legislation that compelled commercial speech. So for example, if you sell tobacco, you have to put a warning on the product. But that's commercial speech. It's very, very limited, and even that's been extraordinarily limited. The Supreme Court in the US in the 1940s came out and stated forthrightly that there was to be no compelled speech generated by the legislative and the executive branches, that was unconstitutional. And it violates English common law tradition. And the fact that it has to do with transgender people is virtually irrelevant. The issue is compelled speech.
It's very possible to disagree with someone and not hate them at the same time. He's 100% right. It's about free speech and the social capacity. I'm sure that man now understands why he's not okay to hate anyone.
Well, in what sense is our society male-dominated?
The fact that the vast majority of wealth is owned by men, the vast majority of capital is owned by men. Women do more unpaid labour.
Very tiny proportion of men, and a huge proportion of people who are seriously disaffected are men. Most people in prison are men. Most people who are on the street are men. Most victims of violent crime are men. Most people who commit suicide are men. Most people who die in wars are men. People who do worse in school are men. It's like, where's the dominance here precisely? What you're doing is you're taking a tiny substrata of hyper-successful men and using that to represent the entire structure of Western society. There's nothing about that that's vaguely appropriate.
There's nothing about that. It's vaguely inappropriate. I love that string of words. She made her points based on a small number of men, and he humbled her by giving his points generalizing a man as a whole. Men live a hard life. Each gender has its battles, and we need each other to fight those battles.
We are both privileged white males. Can we really understand the suffering of women?
Well, it depends on how useful your capacity for understanding the suffering of others is, or how well developed that is. I don't see that it's necessarily any more difficult to understand the suffering of women. Well, I would never pose the question that way, because I don't know how you understand the suffering of a group being an individual. I don't think a woman can understand the suffering of women, because that's predicated on the assumption that an individual can take on the burden of a group, and I don't buy that assumption to begin with. I think we vary in the ability to, let's say, empathize with others, but I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever that you can't empathize across a gender barrier. Otherwise, no relationship would even be possible.
That's fair to say.
Suffering is an independent claim. We can have empathy for an individual, but not with a group. We must all suffer out open identities and what we make of that identity. It's a personal choice more than a specific problem. We are both privileged white males is just a very unnecessary statement, and I'm glad Jordan Peterson gave him what he deserved.
I want to know, what is your answer to young people for some of the really big problems facing humanity, like the climate catastrophe, like economic crisis, like the precarious job market? Because they just don't, you talk all this much about individual responsibility. Most of us are never going to be able to afford to have all of these assets to have responsibility over. So what is your advice beyond banal comments like clean your room?
Well, it's actually rather difficult to answer a question that ends with your comments are banal, politely. So, I would consider that more of an opinionated, personal and political statement than actually a question. So why don't you try reformulating that so that there's an actual question there?
Bam, bop, bada bop, boom, pow.
Even though she asked a question, she wanted to insult him, not really wanting an answer, and I'm glad he saw through that. He literally gave her the treat me with respect, then I could give you my expensive piece of advice attitude.
The equality of opportunity is very important, and actually a lot of men would benefit from that. So
the devil's in the details with regards to equality, because I'm an advocate of equality of opportunity, but I think the idea outcomes, that's an appalling doctrine.
Why?
All right, well,
because you have to produce an unbelievably potent bureaucracy to make the ever greater and ever finer distinctions that are necessary to enforce equality of outcome. How many group differences are you going to equalize across? Is it just gender and sex? How many genders?
No, so
gender and ethnicity? How many genders?
I think
how many
what
ethnicities?
people
How many races?
We'll let Aisha answer.
That sigh precisely conveys how it feels to talk to a person making a case for someone who hasn't thought about all their position and its implications at all. Their tone of why as a challenge to equality of outcomes shows they're no different than a little kid complaining about going to bed. As a rational adult, if you seriously have to ponder if equality of outcome is good, you are disqualified from holding a position of power or reason. He really did expose them.